And from then on, it was over. In Europe, there were three problems occurring between 1939 and 1945. One was the German state murdering selected groups of people. Two was the combat deaths. And three, state control of the economies. Now, I'm going to be America-centric in my analysis. What should America have done? If Roosevelt wanted to save the lives of minorities in Europe, the easiest way would have been to open borders and offer to accept all of the peoples Hitler wanted to exterminate. This would have been useful for Hitler to purge the peoples he wanted without having to kill them quasi-secretly with a death camp, right? That took more resources. It would have been easier for him to just send those people over, right? Because even with the concentration camps, like the German people didn't know what was going on, and like the German mass murderers, they had to do a little dick dance to keep the concentration camps, secret, semi-secret, say they were labor camps or something else, and it took resources to run those camps. Okay, it would have been much easier to just deport all these people somewhere else. Americans didn't even have to know what was going on in Central Europe. Okay, so like someone would say, well, the reason the American government didn't open the borders is because they didn't know what was going on in Europe. But Americans didn't have to know that. They just had to open their borders and be consistent in their support of freedom. Right? They didn't have to know what was going on. They just had to support freedom. And this would have been, and they would have let them in. But because of restrictive immigration policies, those 11 million people had to die, locked in Europe with a Nazi beast which tore them to pieces. All of the civilians Hitler wanted to exterminate in the USSR could have been shipped to America, and this promise to not kill but deport all people that Hitler considered undesirables could have been made in exchange for the U.S. not directly declaring war on Germany, or more realistically, could have been made in exchange for not supporting British involvement. But the labor unions in the United States lobbied to restrict immigration so that they could maintain their high wages. Okay, so we can thank the labor unions. The U.S. didn't deploy any ground forces against the Axis in Europe until November 8th, 1942, in Morocco. The Battle of El Alamein, which gave the British the advantage in North Africa in their own right, ended in November 5th of 1942. And this is November 5th of 1942. And the Battle of Stalingrad ended on February 2nd, 1943, only 4 months after the U.S. troops arrived in North Africa. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, in which the American forces were eaten alive by a smaller German force, was fought between February 19th and 25th of 1943. By the time the Americans started to have an impact on the war, the Germans had already been contained by the British and Soviets at Stalingrad and El Alamein. At the height of their power in 1941, the Germans were unable to invade Britain across the English Channel. The idea that they would have been able to cross the Atlantic and invade America after 1943 is transparently laughable. That was all propaganda. The Americans were not decisive in preventing a German victory, but I will assert that they were decisive in unnecessarily prolonging the war. The situation in February of 1943 for Germany was this. The Soviet Union was outproducing Germany. Even without U.S. intervention, time was not on Germany's side. The U.S. intervention certainly accelerated this dynamic, but the notion that Germany was winning otherwise was not true. Germany had a large quote-unquote empire full of partisans and resistance fighters that took resources to suppress. France had 41 million people. Poland had 35 million people. The occupied Ukraine had about 25 million people. Yugoslavia had 15 million people. Czech and Slovakia combined had 15 million people. Belarus had about 10 million people. Holland, 8.7 million people. Belgium, 8.3 million people. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia had about 5 million people. In total, Denmark, 3.7 million people, and Norway, 2.9 million people. Granted, the Germans didn't use their best troops and latest equipment to suppress these areas, but it still took men and supplies. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were fair weather allies that could and did eventually switch sides at the last moment, at an opportune moment. Romania did this in August of 1944, and the German army later had to take direct control of the Italian and Hungarian governments to prevent them from surrendering. Okay, and so the Axis was more of a coalition than a true alliance. And on paper, the combined manpower of Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Italy was impressive, but in the field, they were just fodder. These were very poor troops. There was an oil and rubber shortage, and the USSR and British Empire surrounded and cut off the continent from the rest of the world. Without Romania, and there were few oil fields in Hungary around Debrecen, the German army was plagued with all these shortages. About 550,000 German civilians were killed in the bombing raids over Germany. Bombing raids that were later determined to have minimal impact on war production. It was just slaughter. It was just an atrocity. Strategic bomber pilots in World War II were not shortening the war or lowering German production. They were just killing people who weren't able to serve as soldiers. On January 24th, 1943, right, and the outcome of the Battle of Stalingrad was pretty much decided by then. In January 24th of 1943 in Casablanca, Roosevelt demanded unconditional surrender on the part of Germany. Now, this was opposed both by Stalin and Churchill. The demand for unconditional surrender was used by the German government as a propaganda tool to fight long past the point where victory or even an acceptable peace was possible. Given the response to what Germany did in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles and the Versailles War Debt, the German government could only imagine what would be done this time. Roosevelt's call for unconditional surrender confirmed their fear that there was going to be hell to pay for World War I. German generals who knew about the Holocaust, right, could only imagine calls for retaliation in kind. And there were a few German generals who did know about the Holocaust, and so they had all the incentive in the world to fight till the end. Not because they supported the Holocaust, but because they knew that, because they believed there would be a Holocaust for all Germans, right? And so German troops were fighting after the Rhineland was taken, and fanatics were fighting in the hills of Bavaria after, and in Austria after the German government surrender. Right? Hitler ordered a scorched earth policy in Germany, which, given the fear that the Americans would destroy Germany anyway, wasn't completely irrational. Right? And in Michael Balfour's article in International Affairs, Another Look at Unconditional Surrender, he wrote, "Those Germans, and particularly those German generals who might have been ready to throw Hitler over and were in a position to do so, were discouraged from making the attempt by their inability to extract from the Allies any sort of assurance that such action would improve the treatment meted out to their country." From the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, a German-language Swiss newspaper, quote, "So far, the Allies have not offered the opposition any serious encouragement. On the contrary, they have again and again welded together the people and the Nazis by statement published either out of indifference or with a purpose. To take a recent example, the Morgenthau Plan gave Dr. Goebbels the best possible chance. He was able to prove to his countrymen, in black and white, that the enemy planned the enslavement of Germany. The conviction that Germany had nothing to expect from defeat but oppression and exploitation still prevails, and that accounts for the fact that the Germans continue to fight. It is not a question of a regime, but of the homeland itself. And to save that, every German is bound to obey the call, whether he be Nazi or member of the opposition." The Morgenthau Plan for Germany was to deport all scientists and engineers from Germany to other countries and turn Germany into an agrarian state with no heavy industry. American public opposition caused Roosevelt to shut up about this plan. Early in the occupation, While there were still many Nazi fanatics fighting guerrilla wars against the Americans, Hoover was implementing the Morgenthau Plan. But it was difficult to uproot the industry and the people, and there was little political will to do so, and the recognition of the Soviet Union as the prime enemy resulted in a change to the Marshall Plan, which was credited to the German post-war economic miracle. A bit of a tangent here, but the reason West Germany did so well was that the Germans resisted the occupiers so much, right? And it was difficult to collect taxes or impose wage and price controls or any license or regulations. The result was that Germany was in a de facto relatively free market for a short period of time in which the boom occurred. And this was not because there was any great free market movement in West Germany. On the contrary, there were nationalist statists, but this nationalism that was still around in Germany at the time opposed foreign occupation, and the foreign occupiers were not able to really extract any taxes or impose any regulations, and so there was a de facto free market, and not a de jure one. But then eventually the states regained their footing, and the taxes and controls were reimposed, and the boom promptly ended. So what would I have the U.S. government do in this situation? 1. Open borders. Hitler wanted to purge undesirables, and this was known before the extent of the savagery was known. Right? Even before people knew the extent of which he wanted to do that, they knew that Hitler wanted to purge undesirables. And I know there was real debate on the numbers of civilians exterminated at the death camps, and that debate is relevant, which I will explain in the next section. But at any rate, the course of action is the same. Right? Provide a refuge, let them in. Right? There's no reason to not let in these huddled masses. 2. Instead of issuing an ultimatum of unconditional surrender, offer Hitler conditional peace terms in February of 1943. Roll back the occupation of France and Belgium. That is, allow German military forces in place, but give the German government no control over the economic affair of the citizens in those areas. Make a 20-year phase-out occupation of those places. The reason you would want to do that is because, you could not have France become a full-blown state again right on the border of Nazi Germany, which is a country that just, a few years earlier had invaded France, right? You couldn't, said, all right, you just, killed a bunch of these people, now play nice. No, you couldn't do that. So you would have to have a graduated phase out over a long period of time, so that it wouldn't, over a period of time for the events to be put less in memory, to go back into the past, so by the time, after 20 years, it'd be 1963, right? And so, yeah. Immediate withdrawals from Norway, Denmark, and Holland on the condition that those states would remain neutral, right? Which Norway was not at the time of the German invasion. Break up Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania from the USSR. Break up Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia from Yugoslavia. Break up Czech and Slovakia from Germany. Make arm balance agreements between Germany, Britain, and the USSR, recognizing the precarious geographic position that Germany is in. Right? Breaking up Austria from Germany would not be in the trade space. Right? Germany is right in the middle, surrounded by all these states. So Germany was in a precarious geographic position. So given an arm balance agreements, they would be in favor of Germany. Germany would have more, according to this agreement, Germany would have more powerful military than Russia, France, or Britain. Doing both of these things would have not only saved lives from the death camps and by shortening the war, but would have prevented the whole Iron Curtain scenario. Racism was already becoming stigmatized by the 1940s, and by the 1970s, the Nazi ideology would be at odds with the majority of Germans, and of course, by today, it would be positively despised. So, Nazi Germany would not have lasted very long. It was, by the 1960s, racism in Germany was political death. I mean, you could say there are many racists running around in Germany in the 1960s. But by then, like, Germany has become an incredibly liberal country in that regard, and the idea that a Nazi government could sustain itself over a long period of time is just silliness. The Nazi governments may have remained in place, but they would be like constantly backpedaling on things that their founders said, and they would constantly be trying to whitewash their image and say, oh, we don't, swastika. Did you know that the swastika actually comes from India? And they'd be like trying to reverse this one. I mean, they'd be doing all these things trying to, shield themselves from massive amounts of criticism. So to summarize, Nazi Germany would not have taken over Europe if the U.S. did not intervene. Closed U.S. borders caused many unnecessary deaths. The U.S. bombing campaign caused 550,000 deaths with no appreciable shortening of the war, and U.S. interference lengthened the war and created the Iron Curtain. Therefore, from any point of analysis, be it economic efficiency, individual freedom, or saving lives, the U.S. should not have gone to war with Germany in World War II. In February of 1943, Germany had a population of about 80 million, Italy a population of 44 million, and the other allies in Europe had a population of around 39 million. This totals 163 million for the Axis in Europe. The Axis states were occupying an area that had 143.8 million people, plus however many were occupied in the USSR, which I estimate about 40 million, so they were trying to suppress 183.8 million. They were doing this while at war with Britain, 47.7 million, Canada, 11.2 million, and the USSR, 128 million, given the land lost during the invasion, which totals about 187 million. And I will presume the resource equivalent of Australia and India were focused on the war against Japan, and so those parts of the British Empire would not be counted against the war with Germany. So if we presume that Canada and the UK were as militarily effective man for man as the Germans, and there were 59 million of them versus 80 million Germans, this leaves us with the equivalent of 21 million Germans in surplus. And so let us assume that the Finns are as militarily effective as Germans as well, giving us 24.7 million quote-unquote Germans. If we presume the USSR was as militarily effective man for man as the Italians, Hungarians, Romanians, and Bulgarians, then there are 83 million non-German Axis versus 128 million Soviets, and this leaves us with 45 million surplus Soviets. So it's 24.7 million surplus Germans versus 45 million surplus Soviets. Now, in this hypermodal analysis, the war appears roughly equal, but this is misleading. By 1942, Soviet weaponry had advanced, while that of the German allies did not. And so Soviet troops, man for man, were superior to Germany's allies, though I would say not as effective as the Germans themselves, and the German allies, as stated before, were ready to crack. And those 187 million people which took resources to occupy, what did they produce? Well, maybe a few munitions and a few volunteers, but they cost more to suppress than what they provided. The Axis forces had more oil shortages than the British, who had the Persian Gulf, and the Soviets, who had the Caucasus. The German drive to the Caucasus was stopped at Stalingrad, and the drive to the Suez Canal, and in order to shut off the Persian Gulf, was stopped at El Alamein. Now, I am not going to make any direct case about the Holocaust. I'm in enough hot water as it is saying what I've already said throughout this book. But I stated before that the bombing campaign over Germany caused 550,000 deaths, and we can only estimate how many total deaths were caused by American intervention and their prolonging of the war. If we presume that Hitler had 11 million people killed, that makes it seem like a war as close as a battle between good and evil as you can get. But if we presume that the Nazis only killed 250,000 people in the various labor and death camps, then that opens up the prospect that American intervention causing more deaths than the Nazi death camps. That is why the debate over the Holocaust is relevant. It's not about making the Nazis out to be heroes or about exonerating the Nazis. That's not what it's about. But it definitely would take a big bite out of Americanist mythology and cause people to take a more critical look at everything else that was done in that general area if it could be shown that American intervention caused more deaths than were killed at the Nazi death camps. And that is why the debate over the number of deaths at the Nazi death camps is appropriate. And furthermore, you could compare this to the number of people killed in the Soviet Union. Right? Like, as a percentage of population, over the same period of time, Stalin and Hitler killed about the same number of their own people. Stalin killed more people, but Stalin ruled a larger state. And so ruled an area with about 150 million people, whereas Hitler ruled an area with about 80 million people, right? Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland had about 80 million Germans, whereas Russia, whereas quote-unquote Great Russia, the Central Asian states, Belarus and Ukraine had about 150 million people. And Stalin killed more people over the same period of time, but as a percentage it was about the same, according to the official statistics. If it turns out that less people were killed in the Holocaust, then Stalin would be clearly much more bloodthirsty than Hitler, right? And if it would be shown that Stalin was more murderous than Hitler, then American support of the Soviet Union against Hitler was supporting a more murderous state against a less murderous state, if it could be shown that the Soviet Union was more murderous than Nazi Germany. Now, it is illegal to question the Holocaust in Germany, and it is illegal to question the Holocaust in various other states. So, given the political importance of the Holocaust, and given the political importance of the Holocaust in relation to establishment of Israel, and given that it is illegal to conduct a direct investigation of the Holocaust in the countries that it occurred, is this not a little bit suspicious? Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. When sharing this argument against American intervention in World War II with other people, even after I make this case, they will often respond, but Nazi Germany declared war on the U.S. first. And at first I thought it was only a few dolts who were saying that, but apparently people keep bringing this point up, and I was stunned. Hitler declared war on the U.S. because he wanted Japan to attack the USSR. When Japan did not attack the USSR, Hitler found himself at war with the United States, which wasn't something Hitler wanted just for the heck of it. Okay? The U.S. didn't have to actually send troops over to Europe, and the unconditional surrender doctrine prolonged the war. If we remove the militarism and remove the persecution of various untouchables by letting them leave Germany, Nazi Germany looks a lot like Germany today. Remember, the Nazi Germany was popular because of the military victories. In 1943, when they started losing, they may have been unpopular, but Roosevelt's call for unconditional surrender made the war no longer about Nazi Germany, but about Germany itself.